Welcome to Rainy Day Rabbit Holes,
a uniquely Pacific Northwest podcast.
I'm Shay.
And I'm Jody.
Each week, we will take you on a journey through the quirky, mysterious, and fantastic stories of PNW history.
So grab your North Face jacket, strap on your Tevas, pour yourself a cup of Northwest roasted coffee, and
let's fall down the rabbit hole. It's 1890. You are a bearded, muscled, horny lumberjack, definitely in a red plaid shirt. And you are in Seattle for a few days before getting on a boat. Your pockets are flush with the money you just earned, and you are looking for a little fun and a way to blow off some steam. Where do you turn? Well, you might head down to Pioneer Square, where you could enjoy the company of a beautiful, intelligent woman and have a hard drink. On today's quickie of an episode, see what I did there? We will be talking about Lou Graham, Seattle's most famous and most misunderstood madam.
Oh, Lou is a lady.
But first, can you do us a favor? If you like the show, please share it with a friend. Links for sharing are in the show notes. Well, Jody, we only have time for a nooner.
Oh.
So let's get into the story. I first want to thank my main source for this story, the great reporting done by Hannah Brooks Olson in the fall of 2022 issue of Seattle Met.
So that's pretty recent.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Jody, have you ever taken the Pioneer Square Underground tour?
Yes, I have. A few years ago, we took the kids.
Do you remember the tour guide telling the tale of Seattle's most famous madam and how sex workers were referred to as seamstresses in those days?
No, I don't recall that. Many, many years ago, I should say, not a few years ago.
Okay.
So, yeah. Mm-hmm. Stories aren't fresh in my mind.
Well, what if
the smell is, though?
What if I told you that tale might be a fantastical fabrication?
Oh, well, that would not surprise me.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I've enjoyed the Seattle Underground tour several times. It's fun, funny, and filled with all sorts of intriguing and naughty history. The tour was pioneered in Pioneer Square.
You're full of it today.
How convenient.
You got it down.
I do. Well, I'm also a comedian as well as a historian.
Well, I think we're all able to tell by now.
So it was pioneered by Bill Speedle, a columnist for the Seattle Times and a self-made historian and writer. While Bill has been credited with helping to lead the movement to preserve and restore Pioneer Square, one of the oldest neighborhoods in Seattle, he might be most well known for his underground tour, which started back in 1965. In 1965, Pioneer Square was crumbling. Buildings were dilapidated. It was a pretty rough neighborhood, but those buildings have a lot of historical significance. They go all the way back to the late 1800s. By revealing the secret tunnels underneath the city's streets, he hoped that interest in the region would grow, saving the old buildings and prevent the concrete monstrosities of the day from taking over. So for those of you who don't know, underneath the city streets of Pioneer Square is basically the remnants of what Seattle once was. So Seattle, that area was built on mudflats. And there was a great fire in the late 1800s and it burnt down everything. And they just started building up on top of that. So there are actually existing old storefronts and the first floors of buildings are underneath the streets. And when you're walking around in that area, you might see purple glass tiles set into the sidewalk. And underneath there is actually city sidewalks. So this underground tour takes you through that and gives you the history of it. It is actually a great tour.
It is. It is.
Whether or not it is historically accurate is up for debate.
You're right. Right. It's fascinating for
but
sure.
But it's still fun. And I still would encourage people to go on it if they're visiting in Seattle.
And I have to say, that's how, if we don't keep taking the tours, that area of the city will disappear eventually. So it's nice that we do those tours and keep it alive, and that history is really alive, and we can go experience it.
Yeah, I've done that tour 3 or 4 times, and I've even done the ghost tour that's late, and that's fun. It is very entertaining, and it's great. And they have different levels. One that's family friendly, and then one that's not.
Right.
The not family friendly one is my favorite, which takes us back to the topic today. So his plan of revealing those underground tunnels to get people interested in the area worked. People flocked to his tours and left with a newfound urgency to save the neighborhood. With all of this newfound interest, he wrote several historically adjacent books with lots of great anecdotes, puns, and quips, but not much in the way of sourcing. He included stories about Lou Graham and her workers, but unfortunately, Bill's version seems to be basically the only one out there. And as the writer Hannah discovered, what it lacks in verification, it makes up for in good storytelling. If you go to the Wikipedia page for Lou Graham and scroll down to the references, you will see Bill Speidel listed as basically the main source. Most tales out there seem to come directly from Spiedel's account.
Interesting.
And he doesn't have sources for his account.
Interesting.
So as he didn't list his sources.
My alarm bells were going off as you were talking. So I'm staring at you.
And most historians have not been able to verify many of his claims. The true story of Lou Graham is probably lost to time.
Nobody wrote a book about her from a memoir of that was actually there with her, or
women in the sex trade were not considered important.
Oh, well, that's true.
So records were not kept strictly of these women.
Well, they were all secret. Everything about them was secretive.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Lou Graham was an immigrant from Germany. We know that. And she entered the United States around the age of 16, and her original name was Elise Oben. Not much is known of her until she shows up in Seattle in the late 1800s, probably 1888, as a property owner in Pioneer Square. Back then, when people would acquire property, a lot of times it was printed in the newspaper. So I actually found newspaper records of her purchasing 10 lots for $250. She had probably already been working as a sex worker, but when she arrived in Seattle, she graduated to Madam.
Ooh, is there an actual process for that? Should take a class
you have to take.
Someone signed off on all of her.
I think now you can actually take dominatrix courses, which would be interesting. Anyway, that's for the Patreon.
That's specializing.
So at this time, Seattle was booming. In 1889, Seattle had become the largest city in Washington with over 40,000 residents. There was about 1,000 people per month moving to Seattle, which at that time was a ton. So Pioneer Square was filled with gold miners, lumber workers, fishermen, all looking for a way to blow off steam and spend their hard-earned money. Graham showed up to take advantage of this boom, established a lush, enticing house filled with singers, dancers, and beautiful, intelligent women. And by 1891, she was filthy rich.
A lush.
Mm-hmm. It was lush.
It was lush. All
so
right.
Her vision was to have an establishment that was like the very expensive hotels.
Got it. So she had a high class.
It was high class.
Operation.
Yes. She catered to many rich and powerful men. And with that, her power and influence grew. So when your clients include police chiefs and politicians and very powerful, wealthy businessmen, you're going to have a little bit of pull and sway, right? Because you know what they're getting up to. So she was famous in the city for her wealth and her influence.
Wow.
She wore the latest expensive fashions and was just dripping in diamonds.
So did everybody know how she was getting this money? And
were
we pretending we didn't know?
No,
were they still?
we knew. We knew.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually found several newspaper articles on newspapers.com from the late 1800s where she was arrested for either prostitution, or most of the arrests I found on there was for illegally selling alcohol.
Oh, that's why I was wondering. Prohibition had to play in that.
And she would be fined anywhere from $25 to $50.
But it was fine because she was rolling in it.
Yeah, that didn't matter to her. She was incredibly wealthy. Most newspaper articles that mention her mention what she was wearing and all of her jewels and whatnot, but there's not a whole lot out there that actually mentions what she looked like. And the photos that you will be shown on that Seattle Underground tour, that they say are Lou Graham have never actually been definitively linked to this woman.
Holy cow. Is this a whole nother rabbit hole where we've been deceived through our tour company?
It's just another Shays ruining something for you. No, I'm not trying to ruin the Seattle Underground tour because it is super fun. Definitely go on it. But just take the history in there with a grain of salt because most of this just comes from the founders' accounts. And there's not always a ton of verification for that. This writer who wrote this article on Seattle Met, she spent years researching this, and she was not able to verify a lot of Bill's story. So
Sure.
that's all I'm saying. Could be true, could not be true.
Well, I have a, Bill's best interest is to make all these stories fascinating.
Well, he's making money off of it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And also he wrote several books, so he's making money off of that. He's now a historian. He's now a popular writer. Right. But he did a lot of good work because he helped revitalize the community.
Right.
So, we can't overlook his importance. And that Seattle Underground tour keeps people, like you said, coming back to Pioneer Square. Otherwise, why would you go to Pioneer Square? Especially now, it's overrun by tents on the sidewalk. And there's a lot of drug use there. It's gotten kind of scary. There's a lot of odor. Parking's terrible.
We were down there for a Seahawks game last fall, and I was like, oh my goodness.
Yeah. It
doesn't smell like an outhouse only because you don't have that little disc thing.
It doesn't smell like that sweet urinal cake.
Yeah, urinal cake. That's what it is.
God.
That's missing from the smell of an outhouse. Otherwise, it's there.
Okay, tangent real quick. One year, my mom and I went down to Arizona to visit some friends and family members. And her friend wanted to take us wine tasting out in the Sonoyta region, which is down south of Tucson. It's kind of near Tombstone. And there was one place, and I normally am not a person that will dump my wine when tasting. They always have that dump bucket.
Right.
I'm always like, yeah, I'll drink it. This wine smelled to me reminiscent of urinal cake.
Ooh, gosh.
It's the only wine I've ever actually dumped.
Pungent.
So I always think of that. Anyway, back it up. Let's keep going.
Urinal cake tangent.
Yeah, so those photos, like we were saying, the photos of her that they show on the Underground tour have not actually been definitively connected to her, so they may not be her. It may just be a photo of a bunch of ladies in a brothel. Although Lou is well known for being a rich and powerful madam, she should rather be remembered for the people that she helped with her influence and wealth. A 1900 article from the Seattle Daily Times told how Lou read in the paper about the case of a woman who had killed her abusive boyfriend in self-defense. So Lou, not knowing this woman at all, paid her legal fees, which at that time was $1,000, about that. Which would be about $35,000 today.
Wow. Yeah.
And at her brothel, women who worked for her could expect significantly higher wages than they could in most jobs afforded to women at that time. So at that time in the city, you could be a seamstress, an actual seamstress, maybe working in the garment factories. You could be a maid. You could be a cook. You could be a cleaner. You didn't have a whole lot of options for a good income. And most of it was just back-breaking labor, right? And she was giving...
You're either on your back or back-breaking as a woman. Mm-hmm.
She was giving excellent wages. A lot of these women were living in her house, so they had better conditions. Mm-hmm. And she cared about the women that worked for her. Also, she was very inclusive at a time when racist hate was rampant. She employed indigenous women, which was actually illegal at the time to employ indigenous people. She employed Asian women. And remember, if you've listened back to our episodes about the Chinese Exclusion Act, anti-Asian sentiment was rampant, right? The Chinese Exclusion Act happened in 1882. So that was in full bore. And some of her best workers were Asian women. Also,
best sex workers. So, and that would tell me the men were choosing those women that they were...
Well, they were exotic.
Right, exotic. So they're discriminated against in the streets, but preferred in the sheets.
There you go.
I can't believe I just came up with that.
Nice job. You also are a comedian and a historian. Or none of these things.
None of these things.
I'm also a geologist and an ornithologist, apparently.
A bird nerd.
A bird nerd. Go back to what episode was that?
That was Crater Lake. It was Crater Lake. Bird nerd.
Sorry, I love you, ornithologists. Don't boycott me because I called you a bird nerd. Hey, I'm a nerd. Okay, anyway.
Yeah.
Moving on. It wasn't just Chinese women, though, that she hired. Her most trusted right-hand man was actually mentioned in her estate, and he was referred to as Chong. He was Chinese, and he handled all of her business dealings.
Wow.
And also,
because he was a man? Like, why did she have somebody else handle her business dealings?
I'm sure probably because it was a man. This is the 1890s.
Right.
Women were not given a whole lot of...
Or was she like, you're going to get arrested if this goes bad, not me?
Well, I'm wondering if I don't think women could even have bank accounts back then.
Right. No, they couldn't.
Yeah. So she'd have to have a man open a bank account for her.
Good grief.
Oh, by the way, all this time she did not have her naturalized citizenship. She applied
she's still
for
German.
She applied for it in 1891 and never actually went through with it, which will come back later in the story.
Would she have been deported?
I have no idea.
I feel like that would be a really hard process back then.
Yeah.
Can't just put them on a plane
First you
somewhere.
have to find them. Because it's the 1890s.
And then we're going to find a ship.
All right. So she has also been credited. She's also been credited with also helping to rebuild the city after the Great Fire because she made loans to people.
Ooh.
Because she had a lot of money.
She found herself in a really good spot. Mm-hmm.
And also, I don't know if you've ever heard about the big financial crisis of 1893, but there was a run on the banks. A lot of banks failed. She bailed out banks, including the Puget Sound National Bank. She made a huge deposit, which helped keep them afloat.
Whoa, Lou, look at you.
Yeah.
Oh, now I'm a rapper.
You're a poet and you don't know it. Even though her brothel burned down in that Great Fire, she was wealthy enough that it was no big deal to rebuild it. And so she rebuilt it. Instead of being out of wood, now it was stone and brick. Bill Spiedel's tour says that in the day, women who were working in the sex trade in Seattle listed their occupation as seamstresses. But according to Brooks, the author of this article, this story doesn't really hold water. So she found a number of advertisements offering seamstress positions at bars and brothels, but she found many, many more court documents clearly naming Graham's girls in arrests for prostitution. So they were not being credited as being seamstresses. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot to be found in employment records or census records about the women who worked in Graham's house at the time, because the census workers didn't even bother to count the women that lived in the brothel.
They were that devalued.
Exactly.
They didn't even get counted.
Spiedel's account also alludes to the notion that something like 2,500 seamstresses were registered in Pioneer Square, but inspectors only found a small handful of sewing machines. So ergo, the seamstresses were sex workers.
Oh, got it. From now on, forever. Nobody shared.
But there were actually many, many real seamstresses in the city, and it was a needed and legitimate occupation. So this does disservice to the women who were actual seamstresses.
Right. So if somebody said, what do you do for a living? Oh, I'm a seamstress. And they'd look at you sideways because they're like, yeah, that's what they all say.
So it was a low-paying job, and it was back-breaking. But it helped create $1 million clothing and dry goods industry in Seattle, and that's $1,900 million with companies like Eddie Bauer.
Wow, all the way from back then. So those seamstresses were part of that.
So the seamstresses in Seattle, while maybe that was a little bit of a euphemism at the time, it kind of seems more like, no, these are actual seamstresses. There were garment factories in Seattle, in this area, on the Seattle waterfront. Seamstresses were always employed because very little mass market production, and there wasn't a whole lot of trade it wasn't like now where everything we buy is made in Indonesia or China and we bring it over. A lot of it was made right there, and if it was shipped fairly locally, right? It does a disservice to the women who were actually seamstresses.
Right.
Because it is a legitimate occupation.
Which is probably why they chose it as their pseudonym profession, because there were so many It was legitimate. It would not be questioned because, sure, there's lots of those.
You would take mending jobs or sewing jobs into your own personal home. So if you're renting a room at a boarding house and you say, I'm a seamstress and I just take in work, if you go in your room and shut the door, you could say, oh, yes, I'm just in there mending.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's true, too. Okay, I gotcha.
Yeah.
And a whole nother way to hide.
Another thing I heard is they said, oh, they found very few sewing machines. Well, a sewing machine was still a luxury.
That's what I was thinking. Most people were doing it by hand still.
Yeah, I mean, there were sewing machines that old, but that would have been something that maybe was not afforded to lower income producing women.
Were
especially
sewing machines in homes, or were they only in businesses?
I think they were in homes, yeah. I mean, there's enough of those wooden table singers that everybody's grandma had one sitting around gathering dust with the pedal.
Yep. It turns into a table.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You never know what to do with it. You feel wrong getting rid of it, but you know you don't want it.
100%.
One of those. It's another way with a lot of antiques passed on.
Yes. No use for this, but goodness sakes, I can't throw it out.
By the way, have you listened to Effed Up History yet?
Yes, I have.
Excellent. Listeners out there, if you like stories of women in history, you should definitely check it out. Christina delves into some seriously messed up history on her podcast with lots of swearing-filled rants. Just my thing. You should definitely check it out.
Yeah, her effed up history is, she's talking about history that's pretty effed up. We just F up history.
That's perfect. Should we send that to her as some copy for?
Yeah, we F it up. You want to?
If you like my effed up history, you're gonna have to go to Rainy Day Rabbit Holes because they just F up history.
That's right.
Although Graham had a significant amount of power and influence, the wealthy of Seattle were pressing the mayor to enforce morality zones to force, quote unquote, dens of vice into smaller and smaller areas. And eventually, Graham's brothel and all houses of ill repute were finally outlawed by 1903. So then she fled to San Francisco, where she died suddenly at the age of 48.
Oh, my goodness.
So Spiegel's tale states that syphilis was her cause of death, but this writer was able to find her estate documents.
You don't die suddenly from syphilis, do you?
Sure, no.
It's a long, ugly process.
Yeah, and it besmirches her legacy, too.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Her death came quickly after she was struck by a sudden pain, and she accumulated a medical bill for $1,740, which is about $50,000 today. And then she passed. So it is thought that she probably died by something like a perforated ulcer or maybe undiagnosed stomach cancer.
Got it. So it's an abdominal thing.
Right. So there are documents of her hospital stay. They do not mention syphilis. It was probably not syphilis. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Do we know if she was a drinker?
I have no idea. Today, her legacy is still seen in her standing brick building at the corner of 3rd and Washington, and it is now the Union Gospel Mission.
What?
Mm-hmm.
I had no idea. I'm
either.
very familiar with that building. Wow, that's crazy.
So there they serve the underprivileged and needy in the city.
So that was the lush.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. And there is a plaque on there, but the plaque has some misinformation on it. When she died, she didn't have a will. And because she had never finished her naturalization, King County tried to claim all of her estates. So she had dozens of properties.
She was still just a German resident or citizen.
Well, and also she was a woman.
Right.
And
she had no family. She had no.
Well, she did.
Oh.
That's the thing. But
next,
she was a woman who ran a house of ill repute. Again, she had never completed that naturalization paperwork. And she had siblings back in Germany. Okay. And they wanted her estate. But after 7 years of court battles, the court split it up. And Highline Public School main office is housed in one of her buildings. That was part of that. And then the rest of her properties were sold off to pay outstanding debts. And auctions scattered her belongings. So we don't have a lot of her belongings. We don't have any actual pictures of her. And
so essentially dollars made it back, or money itself made it back to the family members once it was split up?
There wasn't details about that, what her estate actually got. But the county did actually claim several of her buildings. As Hannah Brooks concludes her article, quote, Speidel was one good storyteller, but Lou Graham's truth was more textured, more nuanced, and more unusual than any fiction.
Like you can't make this up.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to get a little bit more in depth into Lou Graham, and especially what the environment of Seattle was like back in the late 1800s in her time, I encourage you to go over and check out the episode about Lou Graham on Women's Herstory. It's a really well-produced, well-researched podcast that I just discovered. So that's another source I listened to for this episode. And that's the story of Lou Graham in a nutshell. It's a short one. It was a quickie.
Quickie. I know. An afternoon delight, Shay.
Exactly.
Nicely done.
Just in time for Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
This is launching on Valentine's Day. So if you're lonely and horny,
go to the Union Gospel Mission.
Oh, no. That's going to cure your horniness right away. But if you're single, you can visit a sex worker, no shade.
Yeah.
Just
so that
be
sounds like her building, at least her buildings went in a direction I think she would have appreciated. It sounds like, helping
people,
both of them, school district.
Also, I didn't mention in here, she took in several children that their parents abandoned them.
Oh, wow.
Or if families lost all their money, like a lot of people lost their money in the gold rush, right?
Yeah.
And people would be left destitute and unable to care for their children. She took in several children and cared for them.
Wow. In the brothel, or does she have another?
I have
maybe?
No idea.
Holy
Remember,
cow.
This is the late 1800s. There's not a whole lot of verifiable history.
Right.
So I just want you to remember that with a grain of salt. Most sources are this one guy's account. So most things you hear about, if you look at their sources, they're probably going back to Bill Speidel, and we should maybe take his story with a little bit of a grain of salt because he did not reference his sources and he died, I think, in the 1980s. So we can't go back to him.
Right.
And unfortunately, her story is probably just lost to time.
Right. That's unfortunate because it sounds like it's rich with Seattle history.
Mm-hmm.
She is part of the foundation.
Yes,
absolutely, of that city.
Yep,
and how it got rebuilt and all of that.
Yep.
And she doesn't even get credit for it in most places.
So tip your local sex worker.
Yeah, write their name on the walls of history.
Just not the bathroom. Yeah. Or maybe, I don't know. Maybe they'd appreciate it.
Is that the wall of history? The bathroom stall.
Oh man! All right. Just FYI, the music you hear during the breaks is by my cousin Rebecca and her 1990s band, The Other Side, which no longer exists. So thank you, Rebecca, for letting us use that music. It's pretty awesome. The intro and outro music is from Toon Tank. Again, my major source was that Seattle Met article from 2022. And if you're on Facebook, go and like our page. We've actually started posting stuff.
Yeah, it's fun stuff.
Yeah.
It's getting some action. I like it. Good job, Shay.
Oh, well, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Shay does all of our artwork and she does all that social media posting.
Well, technically,
thank goodness.
AI does all of our artwork.
Oh.
My thing that I love to do is go into Canva and there's the whole create your own with AI. And I put in a description of what I want it to be. Like one of the recent ones was a Bigfoot dressed like a pimp rolling in money. So that's why there's Bigfoot in all of them. We both love Bigfoot lore.
Yeah.
That's why there's a Bigfoot on our show art.
Yes.
And we're constantly referring to Bigfoot. He's a big part of Pacific Northwest lore, and we love him. And that's why I put him into the art for everything if I can. Just don't look too closely at hands. AI has not figured out hands, and there's usually too many fingers. Or weird fingers.
We had too many feet one time.
Oh, yeah. There was a human leg coming out of a dog's belly.
It had a boot.
Weird.
It had a boot on
weird.
it.
It was so weird. Sometimes I want to post those just to see if people catch it.
What is this?
Do you see what's wrong with this picture?
Maybe you throw one of those in there.
I should. Anyway, so please, guys, share the podcast with a friend. Follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, rate and review. Follow us on our social medias. Where you can email us with any questions or suggestions.
Yes, shower us with attention. Spread the word. It's how we get to keep doing this program.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Well, we will see you next time with another great historical hysteria story from Pacific Northwest history. And see you down the rabbit hole.
My pronoun is sexy.
Exactly.
Oh my God, we're stupid.